Turn your face to the moonlight. Let your memory lead you. Open up, enter. Is that how memory goes? It's been a while, and I've only ever seen the most recent one. Let's see. Yeah, that's a sad song. Let's talk about different memories and not Kingdom Hearts memories. All right, it's chapter 7 of this world famous lecture series that I've been doing. Popular in at least one country, I've been told. Usually the one that I live in. So this is chapter 7. It's going to be a little bit shorter. In fact, that's going to kind of be the layout of some of these going forward. I'm expecting that the upcoming videos are going to be about like an hour to 45 minutes, maybe hour 15, a little bit less than they have been in the past. But part of that is because a lot of it is building on the foundations that we've already set up. So we've talked about neurons, we've talked about neural potentials, we've talked about how the brain works and how it builds up and how all this cool stuff works. And so now the ongoing modules are going to be like little more specific applications of the broader principles that we've already talked about. So this week we're talking about memory specifically, and it's a fun one. There's some cool examples, some cool videos, and I hope that you're going to learn something. I actually think this is a very fun one to teach, but you know what? I am biased because I like this enough that I'm doing this in my free time. So let's get started. So I'm going to lead with a couple of learning tips. And these can take into anything no matter what you're trying to learn, but we're going to talk a little bit more about why these work specifically. And it's going to be kind of the overall theme here. It's like, why does the testing effect work? Why does elaborative rehearsal work? So let's just say, for example, let's introduce some concepts and talk about some pointers. So let's say you're studying for an exam. Let's say hypothetically, you are enrolled in a remote learning course that is taught to you by a VTuber, maybe one that looks a lot like me. And that class has exams. So there's a couple things that you can do to really prepare yourself using applied knowledge to be a better student and to do better on exams. A big one is distributed versus mass studying. So here's the deal. What I found when I was a student was that a lot of people would cram. They would say, all right, I'm going to study for 10 hours for this exam, and they would study entirely on the night before. And what they would find is that they would oftentimes go cram knowledge, dump it all out, and then basically forget all of it. And the thing is that it doesn't really work out versus what I would tend to do, which is maybe study for an hour or two a day for the week leading up to that exam. And what I would find is that it turns out that seems like it was maybe a little bit more of a better effective study strategy, because by spacing that time out, I'm giving myself a little bit more time to elaborate on and focus on the information as it's coming to me. And we'll talk about why that works a little bit later. Another fun thing, a very interesting thing, is the testing effect. It turns out that just by having taken a test before, you are more likely to do better on a subsequent test. There's a number of reasons for this, one of which is partially just anxiety. So if you are ever going to take the ACT or the SAT, or heaven forbid if you want to be like me and become a doctor who then leaves academia to become a VTuber, you're going to take the GRE or maybe the LSAT. In those cases, the practice tests that they give you are extremely valuable, not even just because of the information that's on them, but because doing them actually prepares you for the format of the test and gets you used to the actual mechanics and the pacing of taking it. And people tend to do better overall. So if you are trying to prepare for an exam, it actually helps to kind of try to articulate and think about things as if, how would my instructor ask this on an exam? I always encourage my students to do this. And actually, when I do teach courses where I do have exams, I always try to tell people, look, this is literally my thought process when I'm writing your exam questions. So when you're studying, try to take that and think, all right, well, if I was a beautiful and attractive doctor, how would I be writing these questions? It tends to work out for people, actually. The students that actually would tell me, yeah, I was like making up and thinking of my own questions are usually the ones that are doing better in my class. So a lot of these come back and connect to as well elaborative rehearsal. So when you are actually studying, it helps you try to create connections between information. You might remember we talked about how neurons work and neuron potentials and neural networks. So it turns out that by trying to connect old information to new information, you're actually creating bonds and connections within your own brain. And actually that is physically echoed in your own brain as new neural connections are formed between neurons. And that can help you remember things over time. Levels of processing, also when you are, this kind of ties together and trying to anticipate and think about the exam as it might be. Levels of processing refers to trying to think about this as you're going through it and looking at that information. Think about it as a way to, as a deeper level of the information. Don't just think about the definition and say, well, here's the word, here's the definition. Try to go a little step beyond that. Try to think of a sentence, etc. It all works to help reinforce memory. And mnemonic devices, we'll talk about in a second, are also kind of a way. Again, a big part of memory is making connections between information. Makes it easier to recall any one bit of information. We'll talk about why in a second. But beforehand, I want you to do something for me. Put down your pencil. Put down, close your, like, actually don't close your laptop. You're watching this on the stream or maybe on YouTube. But I'm going to show you a list of words. And I want you to take a look at those. I'm going to give you a minute. I want you to try to remember as many of them as you possibly can. Go ahead, take a look. Check out those words. There's a lot of them there. Some of them are very tasty. Some of them not so much. Some of them aren't food. Ugh. But give yourself a minute and try to remember as many of them as you can. If you find that you're not able to remember all of them, well, don't beat yourself up about it too much because I can't either. But, there's some important concepts in this example that I think are actually going to be very useful for being able to talk about this going forward. So let's take a second. Let's talk about memory. All right, that's been about the length of one verse of memory from cats. So let's move on from there. So you don't need to write it down. If you're watching this as a video, by all means, if you want to really go along with this, you can pause the video, go along with it, but I'm going to keep going here. So try to think about all the words that you can remember. And did you remember seeing the word cake? Did you remember seeing the word sweet? Maybe you remember even seeing the word sour. Well, let's take a look at the list again and see if any of those words showed up. Well, I don't see, let's see, what do I see? I see sour, and I do see cake, but I don't see sweet. I do see the word sugar, I do see soda, I do see candy, I do see taste, I do see honey. There's a lot of words there that might actually seem like they would imply that sweet is there. They're connected in your brain. And when we think about, when we talk about language and, actually I think next week is language. We're going to talk about the way that words and meanings are connected. And this is like sort of a very basic illustration of how that works out. Because even though cake and sour are there are flavors, there's words like sugar and things that would be sweet, you might remember seeing the word sweet itself, but it is not there. And the reason is because our memories are not actually eidetic or photographic, as some people might like to believe. In fact, our brains very rarely actually remember things as they are. We remember bits and pieces of information, and then our brains tend to work to create a useful picture based on that information that we've just heard. And that usually means that some detail gets lost, and also some details get added that would make sense to be there, but might not necessarily have been there themselves. Now, remember when we talked about how perception works? How there's sort of a minimum threshold that things need to be able to hit. And also that there's way more information coming at us at any given time than we can ever really process, which means that we have to focus on certain bits of information via our attention in order to process and perceive and do all of that. And that all comes up into memory as well. There's way more information coming at us at any given point. And so our brain doesn't really try to retain information as it is. Instead, our brains tend to put together a useful picture, a useful approximation that we kind of might be based on our own experiences, but then trying to fill in those details in order to reconstruct memory and reconstruct our experiences. Because as it turns out, our memory is fundamentally reconstructive. And in fact, our old knowledge, new information that we have learned after we might remember, we go back to look at something, our expectations, are what we are told, or if we are told to frame something in a certain way, if we are particularly motivated at any given point, all those things can skew or bias memory in some very interesting ways. And so some of which make a lot of sense, some of which are probably pretty applicable. You might be able to think about some examples right at the top of your head where maybe, for example, you grew up with this person. You have a lot of good memories of hanging out and playing with them in elementary school, but maybe you drift apart as you get older, and you find out years later that they did a crime or they did something pretty heinous. That might actually recolor your memories of childhood. You might think that you weren't as close with that person as you were, even if you were, because now there's this negative information you've learned about the person. Or you might say, oh, well, I learned this bad thing about this person. I found out that they were cheating on me in class. They were always looking over my shoulder. You might say, you know what? I always had a bad feeling about them. Even if you didn't, it's just the way that memory works. So, as an example, again, I want you to close your eyes for a second. Again, pause the video if you want to. It's no big deal. But what I want you to do is think about walking to a class today, or maybe something today. Maybe you walked into the kitchen, maybe you walked over to your desk, maybe you opened up your laptop. Think about, let's just say, the 15 minutes prior to you opening up this video or this stream. What did you do? How did you picture that? Do you think of yourself as being in the first person, aka you're seeing this as through your own eyes? Or do you imagine this as being a third person perspective? As if you're kind of a floating eye watching yourself doing something. And the way that most people tend to answer this kind of question is that they tend to see memory and they try to reinterpret these events as having a third person perspective. We actually tend to reconstruct our memory of events, not as if we are the ones doing them, like doing the thing, but as if we are sort of a detached observer watching things happen. It's just kind of an interesting quirk of how we tend to perceive things, and really illustrative, right? Because if we were actually had a perfectly reconstructive memory, we would remember things as they happen, but we don't. We remember them from different perspectives. We pull in different information that might not have been available to ourselves in the yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And it's like, yeah, it's like you're in a third person where like you're not necessarily seeing through your eyes, but maybe you don't see yourself. You're kind of reconstructing it in a different perspective than actually happened. That's generally how things tend to happen. It's how I personally reconsider things. Like when I'm thinking about, well, I was running an Among Us game and in my Discord, and when I run up into the stream, hence why it's a little scuffed in the beginning. But when I think about that in the lead-in, I don't picture myself as sitting at my keyboard, looking at my monitor, pressing the buttons as if it's me in the first person. I imagine it either as a narrative, more so with less of a visual emphasis, or I think about it as myself as sort of, again, a third-party actor. I am seeing myself sitting at the computer, typing on the keys, doing what I'm doing, lying to people, and being very... I'll be real. I'm not a good liar. I learned that while trying to play Among Us for the first time. The moment that someone accused me, I was just like, yeah, it was me. You can airlock me. It's fine. Don't worry about it. I might be too honest for this game. But yeah. So, in general, we tend to have reconstructed memories, but regardless of whether or not if you saw yourself in the first person or third person, our memory tends to fall into three distinct categories. We have a sensory memory, we have a short-term memory, and we have a long-term memory. Most people are going to be familiar with the term short-term memory and long-term memory. Those are used very frequently. They're used kind of colloquially to refer to a bunch of different things, but they don't necessarily line up to the way that psychologists and neuroscientists use them. And there's a super secret kind of memory that I had never heard of until I took Psych 101, and that's the sensory memory. Now, what they generally tend to differ in is in terms of their span, i.e. how much information can they hold, and their duration, how long can they hold that information for. Visually, it looks a little bit like this. We have our sensory memory, that is sort of the first stage when it comes to remembering information. We have information coming in from our fingers, toes, eyes, tongue, ears, etc., etc., etc. Sensory memory is the information that is coming to us all the time from our sensory system. Some amount of that information is lost, but some of it also goes on to our short-term memory. And there, short-term memory will sometimes go to long-term memory if it is rehearsed, and if not, it is gradually lost. And long-term memory has sort of a two-way channel between itself and short-term memory. If we elaborate on information, our short-term memory will turn into long-term memories. And our long-term memories can then be called back into short-term or working memory, as it's sometimes called, when we need that information. So dialing back to that first step, sensory memory, one of the reasons that you probably don't hear it very often, or it's not as popular as short-term and long-term memory, is that very often people aren't even really aware that information has even come into their sensory memory. It's an interesting little quirk of the way that our brains work. At the end of the day, our sensory memory is momentary. You might think you've heard something at some point, but then in another moment, like, oh, I might be hearing things or something like that. That's sensory memory coming in and failing. Memory comes in, it lasts for a fraction, like maybe even a second, maybe a couple of seconds. But if you don't focus on it or you don't attend to that information, it's just lost over time. So maybe something might move past, like in and out of your field of vision very quickly. Or you might have, in the case of echoic memory or auditory memory, it might only be a couple of seconds, but sometimes, you might be following somebody, you get distracted. When you come back to the conversation, you can't remember at all what they were talking about. Again, echoic memory. I'm talking to you, I'm attending to you, somebody else calls over my attention, I look over to that person, and then, yep, that information comes back. I return to the original conversation, but I can't remember at all what that person was telling me because either during the break or immediately before it. Yep. So the question is, so our recollection of I think I heard something is a memory of having a memory. Not exactly a memory of having a memory, but kind of, sort of. I guess that's the way you could frame it. Yeah, so if you're like, I think I heard something, but I'm not sure. Oh, it might have been nothing. And then you just, a moment later, you're not even thinking about it anymore. Because you just didn't think, if you don't focus on sensory information, it's gone very quickly. And also information like, I'm going to keep using Among Us examples. Yeah, like Brent just brought up in chat. Let's say you think you see something, but unless you focus on it or specifically try to attend to that information, within a second or two, it's gone. Somebody might pass you in a game like Among Us, or you might read a passage, you might see a sign, pass a billboard while you're driving. But if you don't stop and really think about it or try to process it, it's just going to be gone in about a second. And it's like, if you're on the highway, try to think back even after you pass a billboard. If you didn't really focus on it, try to remember what it actually was on, like what it was about. Odds are you're going to get it wrong because, again, unless you focus on it, sensory memory is lost almost instantly, especially in the case of visual information. Now, but if you do focus on that information, you are going to get to a point where that information is going to get over from sensory memory to short-term memory. Now, short-term memory is still very brief, but is substantially longer than our sensory memory. Most people can tend to hold information in their short-term memory between 5 to 20 seconds. And now the magic number that tends to get passed around is that we can hold about 7 bits of information there. The magic number is usually 7 plus or minus 2. People that really work on their short-term memory, really try to flex those mental muscles, can expand it a little bit, but they still seem to run into a limit where they can only hold information, about 9 bits of information at a time. Now that can mean a bunch of different things, because bits is a very nebulous term. Because it turns out that a bit of information can be a number. So for example, you might say 9. 9 might be one number, but you can also chunk information together, allowing you to hold more information. So instead of being like, let's say, taking a phone number and trying to remember every digit of it individually, you might remember the entire phone number as one chunk of information. You can almost think of it like, oh god, it's like equipment slots in memory. By chunking information together, by making connections between things, you can really stretch and fit a lot of information into that 1-bit slot of short-term memory or working memory. As you tend to work with that information in the, as you guessed it, working memory, so as you think about it, as you focus on it, so let's go back to the billboard example. You might say you pass a billboard and it's for steak sauce. And you're on your way home from work and you're hungry. So you start thinking about how like, I could go for a steak. I haven't tried that sauce before. It seems pretty good. I keep seeing billboards for it. I think someone at dinner, like I was out with some friends and they mentioned that it was good. You start to think more about it. You start to rehearse that information. So you saw it. It shows up in your visual memory. You attend to it, so it ends up going to your short-term memory. And then as you think about it and you work with that memory, you start to rehearse it. And if you don't rehearse that information, things tend to happen over time, where either that information just decays, or is going to decay. So you might say like, yeah, I'm thinking about this one. Like you saw the thing, you start thinking about it, but then over time, you just kind of like lose interest. You're like, why am I thinking about steak sauce? Or somebody calls you, or the podcast you were listening to gets interesting or something like that. Well, then that information is going to start to decay. And it's going to, at first it might be, you're thinking, yeah, like I guess I don't remember what sauce it was. And then you don't remember what it was at all. And it had something to do with food. And oh gosh, you're hungry and that's all you're thinking about now. But information, if you don't think about it, is eventually just going into decay and then fall out of your working memory. The other kind of the double-edged sword here, because the trick here is always attention, is interference. Now you're sitting at your computer right now and you're listening to me. What might happen though is that you're listening to me, you're thinking, wow, this is the most interesting and well-prepared and least scuffed lecture I have ever seen a virtual tuber ever do. But then maybe your phone rings and you look over and you see the notification and you're like, you know what? That's cool. Wow, that's a funny tweet or something along those lines. And then as you tend to focus on other information, you only have so much attention to spread around. And as you divert that attention away from what I'm talking about or what I have been talking about, you're no longer really rehearsing it, and gradually there's going to be some interference. It's a little bit different than decay. Decay is just a process that happens over time. This is because there's more information coming in. Remember, you can only hold like 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. So as more information comes in, and you're not prioritizing it like you would over other stuff because maybe something else is more interesting. Look, my feelings aren't hurt. It's fine. Then the information that I'm trying to give you is going to start to decay. It's going to start to maybe get a little bit, maybe some wires are going to get crossed. You're going to remember me saying something that I didn't, or something along those lines, just because, again, memory is malleable and you only have so much attention to spread around at any one time. So the interesting thing about interference in particular is that it does further break down. So there is the sense of like, okay, well, you don't have enough attention to spend and all that, but there are specialized forms of interference as well that deal with information that deal with the acquisition of old or new, or how you remember old information. So how does this look? Well, the two types that it breaks down into, you've got retroactive and proactive interference in memory. So retroactive interference refers to learning new information that keeps you from being able to recall earlier information. So here's an example. For a long time, I had been focusing on studying and learning Japanese. Hey, we've been in lockdowns, it seemed like a thing to do. In the last couple of weeks, I've also started trying to reteach myself German. And what I have found is that as I learn new words in German, if I try to think, what's the Japanese word for that thing again? I will actually recall the German word instead. It's just kind of a weird quirk of how our brains work, because again, everything's reconstructive in our memories. Meaning that as we come into contact with new information, sometimes wires are going to get crossed, and it's going to keep us from being able to accurately recall information that we learned before. Yeah, so you can have it with that information with language learning is always a great example of this. So here's another good one. I moved. So my billing address has changed. But let's say I haven't updated it yet, and I go over to pay for my gas, and it asks me for my billing zip code. I put in the new zip code and not the old one just because I haven't updated my info yet. Turns out, again, retroactive interference. I've learned my new zip code. It's preventing me from being able to remember my old address. Because when I go and think, well, what's my address? I'm going to the most recent information, the freshest information. On the flip side, take a sippy, there is proactive interference, where old information keeps us from being able to learn new things. So Shai already brought this up in chat. I was going to use video games as an example. Let's say fighting games as an example, or anything that involves muscle memory. As you learn something, especially something physical, you learn a particular way to do it. Whether it's, again, like it's a combo in a fighting game, maybe if you're into weightlifting, I've been going to the gym again recently, you have a particular grip or style that you approach your lifts with, and you decide you want to change things up. But because you learned that a certain way, it sometimes can get in the way of learning new information relative to if you had not learned that other way earlier. So again, going back to language, if you had learned French, you might find it harder to learn equivalent Spanish words today. I mean, for example, I've had this again in both cases now, in both directions, between Japanese and German. So now when I sit there, I'm like looking at like ich ni san, and I'm like, okay, well, how would I count to 3 in Japanese? Ich ni san. Every now and then, I'll sit back and if I don't think about it enough, retroactive interference will kick in. I'll get eins, zwei, drei. Even just now, I thought about it, I almost said ich ni drei. Because again, in this case, these also aren't mutually exclusive. How do I count to 1 to 3 in a different, like, each need dry? I'm just, wires are crossing in both ways, where I'm starting to get different kind of crossed wires there. In some cases, I'll go look for information in one language and get the other. And then in some cases, I'll try to get the new information, and the old will keep me from being able to learn it easily. It's frustrating, but fascinating to learn about, because it really illustrates the ways that our memories kind of fail us in our day-to-day lives. I mean, heaven forbid. Here's an embarrassing story. I changed jobs. And on my first day at the new job, got out of my car and I drove to the old office to my old parking spot. And was late to the new job because of it. Because again, proactive interference. The old knowledge, the old habits are interfering with my ability to learn new information. And so when I go back, where am I going to go? All right, I'm going to work. And so my brain kind of cowpats into the old information. I end up at my old office, and people that see me in the parking lot are like, what are you doing here? You don't work here anymore. Hey, it happens. It happens to everyone. Look, I'm a brilliant and world-famous streaming doctor that does the free lectures, and I still make mistakes all the time. Our brains are just kind of set up to do this because of the nature of how memory operates. But so let's pivot for a second. Brains are sus. There are times, though, where our brains are actually very, in some cases, spectacular at being able to recall information. And so there are certain things that we tend to be very, very good at. And one of which is being able to separate and process information at different levels. And one of which is looking at levels of processing, or one lens to talk about this issue is through lenses of processing, the levels of processing. Which means that the deeper you consider the information that you're taking in, the better you're going to be at remembering it later on. And it tends to follow a certain hierarchy. Visual versus sound related versus semantic. And as you move up in that ladder, you're going to tend to retain information a little bit better over time. So if you are just looking at, let's say, for example, you're trying to remember a definition for a vocabulary test in the foreign language class you're taking in college. If you're just trying to remember and you're looking at your vocab list, if you're just trying to remember the words based on, oh, well, this word comes before this word is next to this word. So let's go back to counting, right? You're trying to remember how to count in German. So you might think ein, okay, ein, 1. If you're thinking about it at a very basic level of just, okay, this equals this, you're not really making a good memory, a robust memory. Versus if you think ein sounds a little bit like one, ein is one, or you're making a sentence perhaps, actually sounding it out, saying the words, you're going to make a stronger memory. And if you take it even one step further and you say, all right, let's say you give semantic meaning to that connection and you say, ein is the German word for one. Or if you're trying to learn vocabulary, for example, you can think about it just as, okay, this is this, and that's what the translation is. But if you try to remember it in context, for example, and you try to make up a sentence, using something in a sentence is going to be a much better way to learn new vocabulary, especially if you're trying to learn a new language, not because it's just you're rehearsing it more, but you're rehearsing it better. You're thinking about it more deeply. And giving meaning to things is going to help us remember it later on. Now, in addition to the way that we focus on things and the levels of processing, it turns out that there's a lot in terms of timing when it comes to how we remember information. We call these primacy and recency. Now, here's that cool little list of words that we used at the beginning. Now, you might remember some of these words better than others if you were even just to be going through and trying to remember all these words in a row. So you might say sour, honey, bitter, heart, tooth, nice, sugar, chocolate, taste, tart, candy, soda, good, cake, pie. Odds are you are going to be much more likely to remember the first couple of words and the last couple of words in that list. And we call these primacy and recency effects. So you think sour, honey, bitter, and then good, cake, pie. Those first three and those last three are going to be the most likely words for a person to remember if they're just going through this list like that. If you do sour, nice candy, tooth, tart, pie, however you want to split this, primacy and recency are very robust effects. Yeah, I feel the same way. I haven't eaten dinner yet, so I'm actually very hungry doing this. I'm like, yeah, good cake, pie. Yeah, good cake and pie. I would like a good cake, maybe even a pie. But we see how this works out, right? And this is pretty applicable, right? You tend to remember, let's say if you live in the United States and someone gives you their phone number and you're trying to remember the digits, you can probably remember the last one or two, but you're probably going to remember the area code first and foremost because, well, as it stands, think about primacy in this way. There's only so much room in working memory, right? Which means that as those first couple bits of information come in, there's less competition for attention. Which means that there's more time to focus on it, and also as you tend to review a list, you're always going to usually start at those points. Which means that there's more time, there's more resources available, and you have more opportunities to rehearse them. And then on the flip side, when it comes to recency, it can be explained because it's the most recent thing. There's been less time for it to decay. So the mechanics of how working memory operates are going to work out so that certain things are going to be more or less likely to be remembered. Oh, that's a good sippy. All right. More fun stuff here. Let's talk about long-term memory for a second. Long-term memory is a very fitting name because it turns out that long-term memory is extremely robust. Long-term memories can last decades. In fact, in some cases, depending on the person, developmental psychologists have found people that can recall information, and even accurately recall information that happened to them many decades, 50 plus, 60 plus years ago. Yeah, maybe if you're even if you're someone like me and you're 24, maybe not exactly 24, maybe a couple years older. What you might find, again, is that you can accurately recall information from when you were a child. So, for example, I was just recently camping with my partner, and we were just swapping stories, for example. And I remember how, when I was a kid, my dad used to take me to the public pool, and there was a hot tub. And if the lifeguard was cool with it, even though you had to be 18 to be in the hot tub, they would let me stick my feet in there, and my dad would tell me stories. And I realized as we were sitting around the campfire that I could actually accurately recall some of those stories that my dad had told me on a whim off the top of his head over 20 years ago. long-term memory is incredible because once information gets into there, it is like a bear trap. But that doesn't mean that it's perfect, because remember that memory is reconstructive, which means that we can screw up and we can end up saying things or misinterpreting information, but the information is still there. And we tend to have two different types of memories in the long term. We've got explicit memory, which is information that we are able to recall consciously. So me saying that narrative, I was at the pool with my dad and there was a hot tub and you had to be 18 to be in the hot tub. And I tried to put my feet in there and the lifeguard came by and told me and yelled at my dad and said that your kid is not allowed to be in the hot tub. I can recall that information. I can think about that. I can picture it. It is an explicit narrative that I can tell myself and then recall to other people. So we call that an explicit narrative. And then there's implicit memory, which is the stuff you don't have to think about. If you've ever had to admit, say, we used the fighting game example earlier. Let's say you get a hit and you hit your opponent in the fighting game. You don't have to think about it. After a while, you just know how to do the combo. You just recognize the timing. You sit down to play a musical instrument and you just kind of know what it should sound like as you're tuning your guitar, and you're able to do it from memory and with just information from your ear, because you remember, well, yeah, the D string is supposed to sound like this. You don't really have to think about it. There's no narrative of like, oh yeah, and I go through there. Yeah, all right, so the question is muscle memory implicit long-term memory? Typically, yes, is probably the best way to think about it. So when we talk about muscle memory, a lot of it is just it is exactly this. It's an implicit long-term memory that you don't have to think about. Maybe a piece of music you've played many times before, you don't really have to think about anymore. Or you have made the same meal so many times, you don't really have to think about it. You're able to recall it without actual conscious information. Or maybe, here's a great example, riding a bike. You don't think about it anymore. Maybe when you were learning to ride a bike, you really had to think about it and you were like, all right, I gotta balance, I gotta keep pedaling. And that is an explicit line of cognition. It is a narrative, it is put to words, and you can say, all right, well then I pedal and I balance and I gotta turn the handlebars and do this. But after a while, you don't even have to think about it anymore. You just know how to balance and you just know how to keep pedaling. You don't think about it. Yep. So here's another good point, how sometimes you don't think about it for a while, and then one day you kind of just realize you can't do it, and that you haven't had to think about it for a while. That's an interesting bit. We'll talk about that for a bit in terms of interference and recall. Like, and this is kind of the thing where it's like, and how long-term memory can sometimes be haphazard. You can have information in there, but again, it's susceptible to errors. And so even though there's a massive amount of storage and information, if you don't recall that information for a very long time, you don't really think about it, you know, your ATM code, the unlock code on your phone, you might stop and think about it for a second and realize that you don't have an explicit memory of what it would be. I've had that happen to me a couple times where like I've forgotten the code for my phone. And then maybe a day or two later, I open it up and I just put the code in without thinking about it. Kind of the problem was that there was sort of an interference, and that I was trying to think too hard about something, and then later on the information just came back, because it turns out that memory is faulty, and it sucks sometimes. All right, so further breaking down, again, we've got explicit memory, which we think about it as their episodic recall or semantic information. So you might remember, all right, well, I remember specific times where my parents were teaching me how to ride a bike. Or I might remember specific information, like how, oh God. I was going to say, oh yeah, the capital of Illinois is Chicago, but it's definitely not. It's Springfield. Like I said, memory doesn't work out perfectly well all the time. Or you know, semantic information. You might think, yeah, who's my favorite virtual YouTuber? Oh yeah, it's that weird deer. Can't remember her name, but I do remember it's a weird deer. It's semantic information. Or you might recall, again, episodic information that's just a explicit narrative of a personal experience. Now, implicit memory, again, can fall into a couple of different points. We talked about conditioning and habituation in the last chapter on memory. So the associations that we make between things, remember we talked about taste aversion, for example. You eat something, your stomach gets upset, and you remember that, and people tend to be very prepared to form very strong memories about taste in particular. It's like if something upsets your stomach, if you get food poisoning, that information goes right into long-term memory, and that connection into that, as well as other kind of conditioned information, learned responses, etc., tend to be implicit. We don't really think about them so much. So in the case of Pavlov's dogs, the connection between the ringing bell and food doesn't necessarily need to be episodic. They might be able to remember, oh yeah, there was a time that the food was presented and then the bell rang and then the food was presented. But the actual conditioned response doesn't need to be an episodic memory. It's a connection that's stored in memory, that's stored away. Procedural examples, again, like thinking about cooking, unlocking your phone, riding your bike. You don't really need to think about it so much. Instead, you could just kind of do it. That's a good example. Yeah, I had one last night. So like I was camping with my partner last night. I cooked a soup, and then I had a little bit of an upset stomach afterwards. The next morning I came back, we had to eat the soup again for breakfast because I made too much of it, and I just did not feel great about it. Yeah, because taste aversions are very strong, and I might not eat that again for a while just because of it. It's unfortunate. But yeah, eggs are always big. Like if you eat bad eggs or spoiled eggs, it most immediately put people off. Taste aversion is one of the strongest forms. Like, it's one of the most readily formed memories that you can make. We are just biologically tuned to really be astute to what made us sick and to just not do it again. All right, let's do a class demo again. I want you to close your eyes. Actually, you don't need to close your eyes. Sorry, I forgot to take the eye closing slide out of here. All right, I want you to read this list of words, or I'm going to read it along to you. Also go through it, and I'm going to say house, throw, sleep, queen, tires, guitar, swim. Now, again, it's house, throw, sleep, queen, tires, guitar, swim. What does that look like here? Now, when I show you, and I want you to fill in the blank, what comes to your mind? K followed by 3 blanks. Remember those 3 words: house, throw, sleep, queen, tires, guitar, swim. I see king, I see cars, I see kiln. I'm thinking about cake spelled with a K, but I'm just hungry. Now, in some cases, what I find when I do this as a live demo, typically I will split the class into 2 groups of people. Some people, I will have them read these words quietly, and then I ask them what they see and how they fill it in. And the other half of the class that hasn't received that information, house, throw, sleep, queen, tires, guitar, swim, tend to have different solutions to this. The people that saw the word queen in particular tend to be more likely to think about the word king afterwards. We call this priming. Exposure to one stimulus may prime, like priming a pump, how someone interprets subsequent stimuli. Now, priming is contentious, I'll be real right now, because there have been some pretty major priming studies that have failed to replicate and it's the bummer, but there are still some very basic cases like this where priming seems to have some effect. So by being given other information or leading information, it can cause us to more easily access other information later on. So again, maybe house, maybe queen, maybe sleep makes you think about mattresses, especially it's right before queen. You think about that, and then you think about, like queen mattress, there's a king size mattress, kings and queens, a house is like a castle. This is what we call a word map or a language network. And by being seeded information into it, it becomes easier to recall other information later on. All right, pivoting here back to that 3-stage model, when we talked about sensory memory, short-term memory to long-term memory, I want to break down and talk about the different stages of memory. How do we actually move between them? So at first, we have encoding. Now, we've talked about encoding a little bit before and in some previous chapters. First, we attend to that information. We encode it into memory. So let's say, for example, I hear something. I'm having a conversation with someone. As I think about what they are saying to me, and I'm processing that information, I am encoding it so that it will move from my sensory memory into my short-term memory. But then let's say, here's the cocktail party effect. We talked about this again before, remember? It's like we tend to be processing information around us, sensory information, even if at some level, even if we're not actually attending to it. So let's say, for example, let's just say someone across the room says, I've been watching that VTuber Ricky Hirsch lately, and you know what? She's pretty heckin' swell. And I think to myself, oh gosh, I have a fan. And I've completely forgotten what that person was talking to me about because I have stopped encoding that information. So in the meantime, I might have been having a conversation with person A, but then when I heard person B and shifted my attention, I also changed what I was encoding. And so in the time that I was sitting there and swooning over the possibility that I might actually have fans, I stopped encoding that information. It stops going into short-term memory. It's like, and then once again, but the information that I had prior to that I was listening to this person, that I was focusing on, goes to working memory or short-term memory where the same process occurs. I think about it, I'm making connections in the conversation that we're having between what they're telling me now and what they told me previously, and that information then goes into long-term memory where it can later be retrieved. Now, encoding, though, is not a foolproof process, much like retrieval. We talked about how memory is reconstructive. Turns out encoding kind of is too. Now, let's just say, for example, I showed you 6 different pennies, and I said one of these pennies is fake. Can you point out which of these is fake? Well, here's the deal. Some of these, for example, I gotta blow this up. Let's say, for example, some of these pennies on the top say United States of America. Some say In God We Trust. Some say liberty. Some of them say 1 cent on the front. Some of them have the year on the left. Some of them have the year on the right. And it's like, but in order for you to be able to pick out and say, that's the real penny, this is what a penny looks like, you have to be attending to those in the first place. And you know what? Every couple years, the Federal Reserve tries to discontinue pennies for a reason. No one looks at them. No one encodes this information. When I show this in class, 9 times out of 10, people get this wrong. And the people that do get it right tend to just be guessing. Because we don't encode that information. If we don't actually focus on it, we can't encode it, and so we don't retrieve that information accurately later on. For those of you that are actually paying attention, I might have blown this up on the video or watching on bigger monitors, and you guessed B was correct, but stop and think for a second if you really knew that or if you were just guessing. Be honest with yourself. The points are made up and the scores don't matter, so it's fine. So even though we can fail to encode information, we can also fail to retrieve information. Because even though we still have info stored, we cannot always access it. So Cadenza brought this up as a good example a little bit earlier in chat. Let's say you are at you open up your phone and you're trying to open it and you're looking at the keypad and you're saying, shit, I have no idea what my passcode is. I've put it in 100 times before, but I cannot remember it. This is an equivalent or an extension of the tip of the tongue phenomenon, where you know the word. You know it, and you're trying to remember what the word is, but you can't quite place it. And it's frustrating, right? Because you know it. You might have episodic memory of learning that information, but you can't recall the actual semantic details of it. And it happens. There can be any number of reasons. It can be attention. It can be that you're just tired, you're fatigued, but it happens regularly enough that most people probably can think of a handful of really practical and accessible examples where they know the information, but cannot access it. Cues can help a little bit, but in some cases, unwelcome suggestions or unrelated cues can actually make it even harder. Yeah, exactly. It's like forgetting a very simple word. You're trying to think like, I know it. What's the word for the thing? If you watch me stream, you've probably seen me have this multiple times, especially if I'm thinking about multiple things at a given point. I'll just be like, yeah, it's the thing. It's the doohickey. Or I'll say a word and it's not the word that I really mean, but like you kind of get it, what I mean from context clues. Again, tip of the tongue. Just because I know what I'm trying to refer to doesn't mean I'm always going to retrieve the right information. Because unfortunately, our memory is, again, reconstructive, faulty, prone to fail, or prone to give us sort of bad info every now and then. Now, there are certain things we can do, though, to improve our memories. So remember when I talked about chunking information before? Remember, short-term memory, 7 plus or minus 2 is the magic number. You can recall 9 things. Now, a thing could be a single digit of a phone number, or you could set up a mnemonic like, oh, here's a good one. 773-202 Luna. If you grew up in the Midwest, particularly in the Chicagoland area, you know that jingle if you watch TV. I don't have to really think about it. 773-202 ba 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 ba. See, even the ba ba bum bum of the jingle is in my long-term memory. This is a mnemonic device even. If I wanted to remember that whole bit of information, that whole string for that phone number for a carpet delivery service from a cartoon that I watched 20 years ago as a kid during a commercial, I can set it to music or rhythm. I can come up with a mnemonic device like PEMDAS, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. All of these different points are ways of trying to condense information down, make connections between nodes to allow us to fit more information into one of those slots in short-term memory. Exactly. So PEMDAS is a really good example of this because it turns the entire order of operations, parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction, into a single word. So you instead, when you're trying to recall that information from your long-term memory, you remember PEMDAS. And then it's sort of like, if you want to think about it this way, it's almost like having file folders in your brain. You've got the PEMDAS file, but you can also then from there recall all the information you have stored there, like parentheses, exponents, so on and so forth, even though it's only the one file on your desktop. That's actually a good example of having trying to organize files on your computer. You can use subgroups and subfolders to try to make things get a little bit more info into one spot. Now, how is memory measured? This is interesting. There are a lot of different ways to look at something, one of which is pretty intuitive, which is just recall. How much information can you recall at any given point? So if you ask somebody, let's say, for example, you're in a class, and let's say hypothetically I'm giving you an exam, and I might say, hey, what are the 2 different types of long-term memory? And you might think, poop. It's short-term and working. But if you're a better student, you might be able to recall that information better and say explicit and implicit. And if you're an excellent student, you might also recall these subcategories, and then I have to give you an A+, and then basically you become the teacher of the class. I'm sorry, there must always be a Lich King. So that's sort of on face a very easy way to think about memory, right? Well, if you remember something well, you can recall it later, right? And if you can recall more information, you remember that information better. Recognition is another way to look at it. And instead of asking someone to say, recall a bunch of information out of the ether, you might say, here's a list of items. Tell me the ones that you've seen before. Now, another way, and this is a more interesting way, is to measure speed of relearning. So we know that information degrades, right? So you might tell somebody something, all right, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach you this thing now, and then we're not going to talk about it for a year, and we're going to see how quickly you're able to refresh your memory. And presumably, if you recall it better, it takes less time for you to refresh it. all of these three are different paradigms that have been used in studies to measure memory and recall. Recollection and recall are more likely to be used. I haven't seen a lot of examples of people using relearning just because it takes a long time and it's very resource intensive on the people actually doing the study. All right. This is more going to be coming up to the edge of the end of the lecture, so we're going to get into like sort of a topic to topic to topic approach here. Here's a fun one. How many of you have ever had an experience where you could not for the life of you remember where you put your keys after you walked into your apartment or to your home? You walk all over the place and you can't remember where on earth you put them. But then you walk back to the front door and you try to retrace your steps and suddenly you remember it. This is because of encoding specificity. Our memories are context dependent. And when our environments tend to match, we tend to recall information more easily. So if you are actually in a class, here's a really practical example. You want to really remember information, sit in the same desk. Pick one desk at the beginning of the semester and sit there. If you are tested on that information while you're sitting in the same desk that you learned it in, odds are you're going to remember that information better. Isn't that kind of Isn't that kind of freaky? But it's probably something you remember, right? Again, it's like retracing your steps. By going back and recreating the context where you're like, I had my keys and now I don't have them. I obviously put them down somewhere. By retracing your steps, you can jostle loose and recall information that might otherwise be very difficult to recall in a different context. Desk changes are, in fact, detrimental to education. Yep, I've heard that as well. So the point here is that eating gum while studying helps you remember that info by eating gum at a test. It works on the same principle. It's like by recreating the context under which you encoded that information, it becomes easier to recall it later on. Now, there is another bit here, and people tend to do better and recall information better when their internal states match. If you've ever seen the movie Beer Fest, they have a whole arc about this. I can't show the clip on Twitch, but in the setup of the film, they can't remember how to get to where the competition is being held. The guy who's trying to show them to the place was really drunk when he got there, so they get him drunk again, and then he remembers. Yep, because I see that some of you have seen it before. It's not the worst movie, but it's been many years since I've seen it, so I don't recommend it. It probably hasn't aged very well, but the general trajectory tends to be true. It's like we tend to, when our internal and external states tend to match, we tend to have an easier time remembering things. If you were hungry when you learned info, you might recall it more easily when you're hungry because we make associations between that information and how we were feeling. So I might be like, so in some cases, here's a fun one. I'm going to bed. My partner says, hey, in the morning, remember to text our landlord about the flickering lights. I wake up, I totally forget about it. The next night when I'm tired and in the same room, it just hits me like a bolt of lightning. I'm like, shit, I forgot to text the landlord. Again, we have a simultaneous example, context dependent, I'm in the bed again. State dependent, I'm tired again. And boom, that information comes roaring back. Yeah, or scrolling back through your social media and remembering a thing you were just thinking of, even if it wasn't it all related to what you were reading. Just matching what you were doing can help jostle information earlier. Yeah, another good example from of people that try to visualize. So they try to remember they try to extrapolate and visualize their memory. It's like a library, and like, oh, I'm filing this information on this shelf in my mental library. Later on, that visualization helps them recall it, because they're like, well, if I go to this spot in my mind palace, I'm able to recall that information more easily because, again, internal and context-dependent states. All right. Okay, so why does this work in terms of biology? This is the fun part. We talked a little bit about this in biological psychology, but just as a refresher, over time, mind palaces can actually be real if you are if you are trying to use them as a memory aid. Yep, the mind palace, that scene from Sherlock is real. I hate to say it. All right, so how does this work in terms of biology? We talked about neurons before, right? As neurons fire, they accumulatively strengthen the connection between themselves. So one neuron sends a signal to the other neuron, and they're like, "What's good, Oomphy?" And they say, "Nothing much, Oomphy." And over time, the connection between them is strengthened. And we call that long-term potentiation. I learned recently that kids say the word Oomphy now, so I'm trying to do it ironically, and I'm sure eventually I'm going to say it unironically, and I'm going to feel very old. But again, the idea is sound. Neurons fire. As they fire and send information between each other, they develop stronger connections over time. And that, oh God, the kids have stopped saying, I've just learned that kids have stopped saying Oomphy. Well, I'm old. All right, so long-term... long-term strength between neurons is one explanation for the biological underpinnings of memory. We also have talked about the hippocampus. In particular, there's one case that shows up a lot in textbooks, and it's the case of HM. HM is a patient that experienced traumatic injury to the hippocampus and found that they were unable to make new memories from that day on. For every day of their life subsequently from that point, they were unable to take information from short-term memory and encode it into long-term memory. Kind of like with Phineas Gage, sometimes we find out the most about how the brain works when people experience traumatic injuries to the brain. Yes, it is also the plot of 50 First Dates, where Adam Sandler tries to romance a woman who, following a traffic accident, finds herself unable to make new long-term memories. So there is, like, the whole plot of 50 First Dates is actually based on a real medical case study of a patient who was unable to make new memories. Every day, his short-term memory would just wipe once he stopped thinking about information, and he would basically default back into the point he was at prior to the injury. So we know the hippocampus is instrumental for transitioning short-term information into long-term memory, but where is long-term memory? So short-term and long-term memory are connected via the hippocampus. We know that. But beyond that, it seems like it's proliferated around the brain. So short-term, long-term memory, we know that the prefrontal cortex is implicated as a very important spot. We know, again, the prefrontal cortex is a very advanced, one of the last regions of the brain to evolve. It's where we handle a lot of cognition and higher level brain function. Consequently, it is also very much implicated in long-term memory, but also the amygdala is going to also be implicated in which is sort of the emotional center of the brain, is implicated in the emotional content of memory. So it seems like memory, like many functions, is split all around the brain. And so if you do experience stroke or a localized incident somewhere in the brain, it's not like your whole long-term memory is going to be kaput or years of your life are just gone, because that information is spread around, it's proliferated around the brain, and that means that those neurons that have been firing, potentiating to each other really are split all over the place. Now, amnesia. How do we explain amnesia? So again, in the case of HM and also the plot of 50 First Dates, amnesia of that particular caliber, we're going to call that anterograde amnesia, which is the loss of the ability to form new memories. There is also retrograde amnesia, which is the loss of past memories. Now, total amnesia has been very sensationalized. It's not a particularly common point. Let's see, what's the question? Why getting hit in the head with a coconut gives you amnesia? Well, it seems that the coconut is actually evolutionarily somehow been crafted to the exact weight, shape, and what would you call it? Hardness? Constitution? I'm blanking on the word. But basically, coconuts have been crafted by nature to be abominable heartitude. Have been crafted by nature as abominable tools that are perfectly suited to wiping our memories by hitting us on the head. Next question. Density. That's the word. See, memory, it worked. Yeah, they have the exact combination of factors. Yeah, it's check out my next lecture series. We're going to talk about the evolutionarily parallel track of the coconut and the development of higher level brain function in vertebrates. So, how does memory affect people over lifespan? Turns out memory is going to differ a little bit as we get old, but the same basic principles of encoding, retrieval, etc. are going to always apply. Let's see. Let's get a question. I've heard before that our names are the only things that we never forget, even with amnesia or dementia. That one, I am not so sure. I have definitely come across studies. I'm not so sure about amnesia. Amnesia, like I said, is very rare. It tends to only show up in case studies. So I'm not 100% on that one. I want to say that I've read some case studies of people with dementia who have forgotten their names. So it might be the case where that might happen, but I'm not sure either way 100% where I'm willing to really stake my, wager my VTuber model on it. All right. Memory over lifespan. Yeah, it's high tier. That is high tier depressing, isn't it? Oh boy. Anyway. Memory over lifetime. So it turns out that most people do not remember the first 3 to 5 years of their lives. Now, in some cases, people that have very traumatic events, highly emotionally charged memories, will be able to recall early childhood memories, but by and large, most people do not remember the first 3 to 5 years of their lives. Now, for me, I'm able to recall some memories from about the age 3 onward, but I have no memories beyond that. It's kind of like it picks up by a certain point. Why does this happen? People don't really know. But in most cases, almost all cases, people will forget their early childhood memories, except sometimes in the case of highly traumatic information. Now here's where things get kind of sad. In fact, quite terrible. Turns out memory changes over time. People can disagree on events. You might remember taking a trip to Six Flags in one city, but then someone tells you we didn't go to Six Flags, we just went to a different amusement park. But in general, again, memory is reconstructive. Now, there are, however, flashbulb memories, highly emotional, highly detailed memories, and these tend to even be shared around generations. So, in my case, I perfectly remember where I was at 9/11. I was in middle school. I was working on the computer in the library. I remember the librarian. We had the old carts with the big the VHS player and TV on them. And I remember the librarian taking one of those carts, turning it away so no one else could see it, but I could see her face and she looked stunned. Later on, when they told us what had happened during an announcement later on in the day, we were told that what had happened and when it had happened, and I realized that when I was in the library working on that project, that was when the second tower fell, and I was watching that woman's reaction to the second tower falling. Yep, this is true. So they pointed out flashbulb memories are not admissible in court. Yep. So there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about that in a second. So flashbulb memories tend to be highly emotional and tend to be shared across people. They tend to be highly detailed. The assassination of JFK, the assassination of MLK, let's see, 9/11, Pearl Harbor, the big moments like that tend to be very certain and very detailed in people's minds, but they are also often inaccurate. See, that's the thing though, and that's the trick, because that doesn't mean those memories are not reconstructive. People are very certain. They are very confident in what they are telling you, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are right. And in fact, people are able to fabricate flashbulb memories in lab studies. So let's pull up one here. Let's see, where is my Chrome window? Where is my Chrome window? It's not that Chrome window. Actually, it might be. Let's see, here's my window. Boom, there we go. All right, I'm gonna grab one quick thing here though. It turns out, here's the lyrics to Memory from Cats. You can actually implant information into people's minds, especially when it tends to be highly emotional. So let's go over the famous Lost in the Mall study. Let me know if you can, and make sure that you can hear it, so just let me know.
In her challenge to the idea of repressed memory, Elizabeth Loftus set out to demonstrate experimentally how false memories could be implanted in some people. This came to be known as the Lost in the Mall technique from the first study that involved trying to plant false childhood memories in 24 participants.
Once again, the characteristic, the number one thing that every famous psychologist does is fuck with people. Like, what if we just made people think that they were lost in a mall as a child? I bet we could do that.
We contacted their mother or their father or an older relative of theirs, and then we went back to the subject and we said, we've been talking with your mother. We found out some things that happened to you when you were about 5 or 6 years old. And we'd like to see what you can remember about these experiences that your mother told us about.
Participants were given 3 true experiences and a false one that involved being lost in a shopping mall as a 6-year-old.
Your mother told us that you were shopping at the corner shopping mall on a Saturday one time, and you were by the pet store, and all of a sudden you disappeared and you were gone for the longest period of time. And eventually we found you, you were crying, and an elderly woman had rescued you and brought you back to the main office. Do you remember that experience?
The researchers were able to plant false memories in 25% of their participants, a statistically significant figure. And what surprised them was the rich detail of these false memories.
They would start telling us things, details about the appearance of the person who rescued them, other kinds of details that we had never mentioned to them. So that showed that they were putting a lot of sensory detail onto this created memory.
From this investigation, Loftus set out what she thought was the recipe for planting false memories. First, you need the client's trust, and therapists usually had that. Then you suggest something that might have happened, and bring in persuasive supporting evidence.
So she would go into therapy with an eating disorder or depression or whatever her problem is, and she'd end up with a therapist who says, everyone I've seen with those problems was sexually abused as a child. I wonder if anything like that happened to you.
So third, you ask clients if they can remember this happening to them. And sometimes they begin to add their own details. They take ownership of the memory.
This was going on really all across North America and then other parts of the world. Families were being destroyed in the process because once people developed these memories, they then accused their family members or other relatives or other former neighbors or former teachers, former anybody.
All right, that's enough of that one. So yeah, a couple of you have brought this up already. Well, it's actually, that's wild, Cadenza, that you've actually been to this mall before. So I have had the privilege of seeing Elizabeth Loftus give a talk. She's incredible, wonderful, wonderful speaker. And really, I tried to play this up as being funny, of like, they just fuck with people, right? The galvanizing incidents of why they did this study was built around the Satanic Panic of the 1970s and 80s, where there was a wave of accusations of children and people feeling like they had been victimized, coming to very vivid recollection that they had been victimized by satanic ritual sexual abuse, sometimes by friends, by neighbors, by teachers, and there was a rash of accusations that ran across the country and seems to be kicking back up again via QAnon. But in those moments, it's like these people would, based on some seeded information, be able to extrapolate and create extremely rich and detailed flashbulb memories that were completely fabricated. And now, again, like I brought up here, it's like cops also do this. In some cases, cops do this deliberately to people. There is a reason that you should not be alone with cops, because they do this very frequently. This comes up a lot in terms of false confession narratives. They do this exact thing. They recite a story, they keep giving the person information to eventually get the person to make a confession that they themselves believe, that they are wrong. That the person, like, maybe I was there, maybe I did do this crime and I just forgot about it. It's a terrible thing. Ugh. Yeah, let's give it's extremely messed up. It makes me very angry when I think it's one of the things that, like, there are a few things inside that about applied psychology that make me angry. The cops using this kind of information to elicit false confessions from people deliberately so that they can solve cases it makes my blood boil. Remember, I'm never political, though. I'm never political on my channel. Anyway, in a more benign example of this information, there is the classic misinformation effect, or the car crash effect. In another study, participants were shown a video of two cars colliding. They were then told in a prompt to try to estimate how fast the two cars had been going. And they were it was manipulated whether or not there's how fast were the two cars going when they bumped into each other versus when they collided or when they smashed into each other. And the wording of that prompt caused them to remember that information differently, because our memories, even memories that we are very certain of, are very malleable and can be very inaccurate, even though we swear that it happened. So here's another fun example here. And by fun, I'm going to say not fun at all and actually kind of terrible. Let's see. How long are these? These are both pretty good. I'm going to hold off on the eyewitness identification video because it's kind of long, but I'll put a link in the chat. And if you want to take a look at this one, I would actually highly encourage checking this out. It's very cool because we're going to talk about we're going to talk about cops and eyewitness identification pretty regularly. When you think about it, if you are, let's say, the victim of a crime, let's say you're mugged, highly emotional point, highly emotional memory, but is it always necessarily accurate? There's been a lot of research on eyewitness identification. And here's a clip from the Discovery Channel, which hopefully won't get me...
It's gripping stuff.
Don't get me caught here. But it's good.
Stop. Wait a second. Wait.
The purse is gone in just 9 seconds. It's a Monday morning at Brooklyn Law School. And Professor Margaret Berger is deep into the minutiae of case law. It's gripping stuff.
Stop. Wait a second. Wait.
The purse is gone in just 9 seconds. But a room full of law school students watch it happen, and they become eyewitnesses themselves. This is not a real crime. The whole thing is staged for the TV cameras. The purse snatcher, a TV employee. Once it's over, they're asked for a description of the intruder.
I wonder if I could describe him. I don't remember a thing about him, other than maybe odd shape of nose.
The class is warned not to share their thoughts about the intruder. Clearly, this incident, taped in 1995, is not a rigorous scientific experiment, but it does yield the kind of results that investigators run into all the time as they look for that crucial eyewitness, the one whose testimony could provide the big break. Roy Malpass is a psychology and criminology professor at the University of Texas. He was a consultant for this demonstration. The day after the staged purse snatching, Professor Malpass interviews 29 of the student eyewitnesses to get their descriptions.
5'6" or 5'7"?
5'7", 5'8".
5'9", 5'10",
5'11".
6 feet.
6'2".
Descriptions of what the intruder was wearing are all over the map too.
He had a ski jacket on with yellow trim on the pockets.
He was wearing a ski jacket. It was white.
Their shirt was a plaid pattern. I think it was a dark plaid pattern, like brownish.
In fact, the purse snatcher had on a white t-shirt, a denim shirt, a blue ski jacket with black trim and jeans. The student eyewitnesses don't fare any better describing his face and hair.
He has like a rounded face.
A slim face.
No.
It wasn't entirely straight. It seemed like it had some kind of wave.
It was straight, probably shoulder length, or not shoulder length, short.
No.
I think he was slightly balding.
No.
He had a really weird looking nose. It looked like it was off, like it might have been broken or something before.
JP was the guy who ran after the intruder. There's an important reason he remembers something strange about the purse snatcher's nose.
I don't remember a thing about him, other than maybe odd shape of nose.
It is false information planted by Berger, and JP processes it as a fact. It shows just how malleable memory can be. Afterwards, JP doesn't even remember the professor's comment.
I don't know, I've been tuning out professors since I was 12.
So, is there anything odd about the...
Wait, why are you talking to professors when you're 12 years old? Are you the most advanced person I've ever seen?
Perpetrator's nose at all? JP tries to identify the intruder from photos.
I'd say that's...
He was in uni before puberty.
Didn't have any problem with his nose. No more than arrested him.
Memory isn't always the most reliable way to identify a criminal suspect, even though the stakes couldn't be higher.
Not only do people not do it well, but they don't understand why.
Yes,
that
law school yet.
contributes to it not being done well. So that police would use procedures that don't work very well, and they're completely unaware of the fact that the procedures aren't working well.
So again, here's the problem with that. This is an old bit. You can tell because it's the Discovery Channel and not a rerun of Mythbusters or whatever the hell they have on the Discovery Channel now. But here's the thing. Sometimes police are very aware of these things because we've had these litigations and people know, they have talked about these things extensively. They do know what they're doing. They do know that eyewitness testimony doesn't work. They do know that people tend to be very malleable. They do give people leading information. And it sucks. All right, let's get back to this here. So I've got this as well, the Innocence Project video. There are some ways that this information has been used structurally to improve stuff like how people recall information and how people and stuff like that, and like how lineups are structured, but it's not perfect. All right, here we go. So in the case of eyewitness testimony, confidence is not about accuracy. It's actually very weakly correlated. People tend to be actually systematically worse when observing someone of a different race. They tend to be worse when they have talked to another witness, and they tend to be worse when there is a weapon or something stressful present, because they fixate on the threat and not on the person. And yet, people tend to be very confident in their recollections. And this is also true when it comes to the testimony of toward children. I mentioned the Satanic Panic before. Children are, if people are already, adults are very vulnerable to suggestion, children are even more so. And in fact, repeated questioning, especially when children say that this did not happen, will actually usually get them to fabricate a memory into saying that it did. So this came up in the 80s and 90s, particularly around repressed memories, around the Satanic Panic and sexual trauma. So in many court cases, these repressed memories were taken as evidence, even if there was no evidence whatsoever to support that these events had actually happened. People's lives were ruined. And in fact, even the victims of errant or malicious psychologists who had maybe in some cases, maybe with good intentions, tried to uncover sexual trauma, or they really believed the idea about repressed memories, they ended up actually implanting very vivid false memories of trauma that tore families apart and horribly ruined people's lives. Both the people that were accused, in some cases doing jail time, and the people who now had to live with this very vivid trauma. That didn't happen. It sucks. It makes me so angry to think about. And that's the note that I guess we're ending on, is about sexual trauma and the Satanic Panic, and really the importance of understanding that memory is faulty, and people tend to screw something up. So let's take a look going forward. What is going on for Chapter 8? Chapter 8, we're going to be getting into thinking and reasoning and language, which should be a lot of fun. Should be a welcome break here. We talked a little bit more already about memory and about connections and cognition and attention. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. We're going to get more into the dynamics of language acquisition and development and why it is so hard to learn a new language, and it should be a fun time. Beyond that, I'm going to stick around for a little bit here. I do need to go eat dinner, and I'm going to go switch over to office hours. So yeah, if you're catching this live, you're going to get a chance to ask any questions and hang out for a bit. But beyond that, I'm hoping that you had fun. I hope you learned a little bit of something, and please tune in next time for a little conversation about thinking, reasoning, and memory. Take care.